So now that we've installed the failover cluster feature, let's take a look at how we would create a failover cluster. Now, limitation here, I'm working on a single server, so we're going to make a cluster of 1, which I know 1 does not a cluster make, but it'll let us walk through the process anyway, and we'll be able to talk about what you would normally do with it. So, I'm going to go to Tools and Failover Cluster Manager. So here's my failover cluster manager. I don't have any clusters created yet. So if I had a cluster, I could right click up here and connect to a cluster. I can also validate configuration or create a new cluster. Now, you're going to need to validate configuration before you create it. And we can use that to validate configuration of servers in preparation for creating a cluster or validate the configuration of an existing cluster. I'm going to skip that because it's going to prompt me to do so here when I go to create a cluster. So I'm going to click create a cluster here, and before you begin, yeah, we know. All right, now these are the servers that you're going to add to the cluster. And I'm going to just link to 27.0.0.1. So I'm going to add myself here as a loopback. And it finds server.dalton.local. And then I add in any other servers here that I wanted to add to my cluster. But since I only have one, I'm just going to go with that one. All right, we're going to set the cluster name. And I'm going to be very creative here, and I'm going to use the name cluster. Normally, obviously, you would give it a much better name, but, you know, it's what I've got. So then here you're going to have all of the networks that your cluster member servers are attached to. And in this case, I'm just got one, the 10.1.1.0 network. Now I need to give it an IP address. This is not going to be the IP address of one of my servers. This is going to be another. So every one of my servers is going to have an IP address. And then my cluster is going to have an IP address. And I need to make sure that that doesn't conflict with anything else. So I'm going to use 10.1.1.5 because I happen to know that one's free at the moment. So remember, separate address is going to be a virtual address that all of your cluster servers are going to be able to use. And then I'm already using 5. Never mind that being free. Let's go 7. Let's go 29. There we go. Just so that I know I don't do something that I've already done before. All right, so it comes up to confirmation. So this is our cluster name cluster, the nodes, the registration is going to be in DNS and Active Directory, domain services, the IP address. Yep, we're good with all of that. And we're going to work on creating a new cluster. Now, I have ran a validation on this before, and I forgot that I'd run a validation on it. So if you get a message prompting you to run validation, then you need to run that validation before you create the cluster. So I'm going to click Finish to create my cluster, and let me show you what that validation process looks like. So I can right-click and validate configurations. Notice here under Configure being selected on this cluster, I also have the option to validate a cluster. So let me right-click, validate configuration here, because this is the way you would do it before you create the cluster. You click Next, and then I'm going to see if it'll let me do my local server. And Next. And then here you can select which test to run. So I'm going to go ahead and run all tests, which is your recommended options. And this will take it a couple of minutes as it runs through all of our tests. Now you'll notice when I selected my server, you might have seen it in parentheses. It said it was already part of a cluster, had the server name in parentheses cluster. That was identifying the cluster that it was already a part of. But if you're not part of a cluster, you won't have that. Okay, so we're going to give this a minute to finish running all of its tests. And normally it's only going to take a couple of minutes. But I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while it finishes, unless it beats me to it. Ha! It just about beat me to it. We'll go ahead and hang on. Now, you'll see the progress bar, and here are all of our results. So this is the end result. It was validated. If you want to see more detail, you can click View Report, and it's going to generate a web browser or HTML report and open it up in your web browser. Let me just maximize that. So here's all the categories, and you'll see warning, success warning, not applicable, not applicable. All right, warnings do not keep you from running, but Let me go to my network, and I'll click on the network, and under the network, I have success warning, validate IP configuration. Let me see what that warning's about. So I'll click on it, and it'll take me directly to that. Validate that IP addresses are unique and subnets are configured correctly, and then it'll give you all of the information. And then down here, in yellow, is the warning. The node does not have, and a node is just a device in the cluster. The node does not have an adapter usable by the cluster with a defined default gateway. That's true, I don't. The DNS suffix search do not match. That's true, they don't. So what you would do is you would look at these and you'd say, all right, is this a major issue or not? And if it's something that you expect, then you can go ahead and skip that. And you have the option right here to create a cluster using the validated nodes. I've already created a cluster, so I'm going to skip that. But that's how you would run your validation before creating the cluster. Now, once you have created the cluster is right here. So you click on it, it's now cluster.dalton.local with that IP address, gives any events, and then here's my configurations. I can configure a role. So cluster itself doesn't actually do anything. You have to add a role to the cluster. So what we have here is a cluster of machines that are doing nothing. So we add a role to the cluster, and then they will start serving that role on the network. We can validate the cluster, which runs another one of those tests. We can add nodes to the cluster, copy cluster roles, do cluster aware updating. If you expand this, you'll see roles, of which we have none defined at the moment. We'll do that in the next video. We'll see the nodes and what their status is. Whether they're assigned to vote, what their current vote is. You have to have more than 50%. So you have to have a quorum. You have to have at least 51% of devices in the cluster up in order for the cluster to be active. We have storage related to the cluster, disks, pools, and closures. We have networks related to the cluster, and we have cluster events. All right, so at this point, you click back here on cluster. At this point, our cluster is up, and you'll see that down here, cluster core resources. The cluster is online with the IP address that's online. So at this point, our cluster is operational. Not doing anything, but operational. A couple of other things we'll want to do is we'll want to add a cluster role, and we're going to want to deal with quorum configurations. We're going to deal with those in our next couple of videos.